This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Dear Diary, who knows how long it's been since I became stranded here. No ships on the horizon, no signs of civilization to be seen. Maybe it's been days, weeks, maybe it's been 5 minutes. I'm beginning to lose all hope. As I waste away here, forgotten, perhaps thought dead by my loved ones, I have begun to think upon the great mysteries of the world. But one mystery plagues me the most, so much that it shakes me to my very core. Do you think Blackbeard and the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet ever explored each other's bodies? I think I am alone in this quandary. Perhaps all is lost. Except apparently I'm not the only one who's ever asked that question. I've had this video topic on my list for just under a year now, so you can imagine the nuclear shock I had when I got on Twitter one day to see everyone screaming that there was a hot new pirate show that had the balls to make Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. Is this even a spoiler at this point? Oh well. Obviously, major spoilers ahead for the show Our Flag Means Death, that had the balls to make Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet kiss. And honestly, if you haven't watched it by now, I highly recommend amending that. Our Flag Means Death, a currently 1-season, 10-episode long show on HBO Max created by David Jenkins, is loosely, and boy do I mean loosely, rooted in the real-life story of the unlikely partnership between infamous pirate Blackbeard and the wealthy landowner turned pirate Stede Bonnet. It's a literal rom-com with a large and colorful ensemble cast and literally 3 canon queer couples, so far including, of course, the 2 main characters. Don't worry guys, there's no queerbaiting here. It took me until literally episode 9 to believe that they were actually gonna go there, and holy shit did they. But I would be remiss to acknowledge the admittedly explosive cliffhanger ending that actually made me have to get up and walk away from my computer and stand in a corner in silence for several minutes because... So it should be very clear that while rooted in the true history with way more nods to real-life facts and events than I expected, the show takes a very stark departure from the facts in most aspects. It's extremely clear that the creators did a great deal of research and then picked out some stuff to keep and consciously dumped the rest, and, well, it really works. I'm a fan of Black Sails as well, and that show took a similar route with regards to the true names and history that it borrows from. Our Flag Means Death and its characters aren't trying to teach you real history, nor do we want them to, because being divorced from the constraints of historical canon has really allowed it to bloom in its own unique way. But you may be left wondering, what did happen in the real history? Who really were Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet? Come learn with me. So, as usual, some brief disclaimers. If you're going into this video looking to stan the real-life Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet, you'd better get your hopes down. They were not good people, and we're going to be frank about that. We will be discussing some pretty graphic violence, and obviously, we have to touch upon the transatlantic slave trade. Additionally, going into this, it needs to be clear that most biographical points about historical famous pirates are highly disputed. I've done my best to sort through the confusion, but you'll notice that most of my sentences in this video will be like, allegedly this, or they say that, or something. There's very little in these stories that we know absolutely for certain. I hope that you'll enjoy the ride anyways. So, let's dive in. But first, let's hear a quick word from today's fabulous returning sponsor, Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace to host my portfolio site for a while now, and I seriously couldn't be happier. My old site, frankly, looked super dumpy and clunky, because honestly, graphic design is not my passion. So it was such a relief going into Squarespace and seeing how quick and easy it was to make a gorgeous new site in only a few hours. It also has seamless video embedding tools and gallery integration with image scaling, so my work is easy for viewers to browse. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business or showcase your work. They have an enormous amount of beautiful and easy to customize templates to suit your needs, whether you're presenting your projects like me or trying to sell your wares online. Plus, Squarespace automatically reformats your site for mobile, and obviously every website has to be mobile compatible. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/CazRow to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using my code CazRow. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning the very fraught history of Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. This is going to be a somewhat brief overview of some pirate background info because I'm actually going to make a future video completely dedicated to gay pirates, so Sorry about that. Something to look forward to, though. The world of pirating in the Golden Age of piracy was inherently very motivated by both politics and money. Piracy in itself was a type of business and operated as such within its own world and in relation to the systems surrounding it. Pirates cruised along the well-established shipping lanes in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and the Caribbean. The movement of merchant ships wholly determined where pirates went, and honestly, if you get down to technical terms, there wasn't much difference between life on a pirate ship and life on merchant ships when it comes to daily activities and amusements. Now, if we're speaking in broad terms, there were two types of piracy in this era: regular piracy and privateering, which was functionally state-sanctioned legal piracy. Privateers had a license to attack and plunder the ships of hostile enemy nations, so, for example, privateers from England could attack and plunder Spanish ships when England was fighting the Spanish, with no retaliation from the English authorities. Pirates, on the other hand, made no bones about who they attacked. Usually. Many pirates became so after careers as privateers. Blackbeard himself may have been a privateer before he was a pirate. Most of what we know about the most famous names in pirate history comes from various court or naval documents and letters, but the most notorious contemporary source is a book called A General History of the Pirates, from their first rise and settlement in the island of Providence to the present time, with the remarkable actions and adventures of the two female pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, to which is added a short abstract of the statute and civil law in relation to piracy. By Captain Charles Johnson. 18th century book titles are a roller coaster. This book, which we'll refer to frequently in this video, has never been out of print since it was published in 1724, 6 years after the deaths of Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. Captain Johnson writes in great detail and extravagant prose about the famous pirates of the era, and the book has served as the primary historical resource for pirates for 300 years and influenced the pop cultural images of every pirate it describes. The problem with this book, though, is it is wildly unreliable. For much of it, there's no way of knowing if what it says is actually true. Frequently, Captain Johnson either states incorrect facts, or outright lies, or embellishes and dramatizes events. There are many parts of it that have been proven true over the years by researchers, but it's definitely a mixed bag. Therefore, I'll say that we can't use A General History of the Pirates as the Pirate History Bible or something, but I will be referencing it in this video where it's applicable, and we'll take Captain Johnson's words for what value they offer. While accounts like Captain Johnson's influenced ideas portrayed in movies about what life on pirate ships were like, it was in reality fairly well organized and more democratic than life was on merchant ships at the time. In fact, the treatment of crew members on pirate ships was often an impetus for men to become pirates in the first place. Oftentimes, the captains of merchant ships treated their men horribly, physically tortured them, even killed them, or starved them, or stole their money. The shadow of the hierarchy that merchant and naval captains stood upon was incredibly imposing, and the crew had no option to mutiny. On a pirate crew, though, the hierarchy was much, much smaller. The captain, who would have often been elected by the crew, was more of a guide and even slept in the same quarters as the men, and the plunders they made were frequently split evenly among the crew. Everything was shared, and most things were equal. This means that a lot of the time, when pirates plundered merchant ships, a lot of the ship's crew members may have actually volunteered to join the pirate crew looting them. In fact, it was incredibly rare for people to be forced into piracy against their will. These crews didn't need to force anyone. Actually, so many people were saying fuck it and becoming pirates that it actually became a real concern to everyone who wasn't a pirate, and even influenced them to adjust some rules on how merchant crews could be treated. Becoming a pirate would have also held a particular draw for queer men. A ship behavioral code used by the pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts listed death as the punishment for bringing a woman on board the ship, so as you can imagine, a pirate would have had a lot more opportunities to nurture relationships between men. In the non-pirating world, things were legally hostile towards gay men. Sodomy and buggery laws established in England in the 16th century typically ordered a death sentence for offenders, although people were certainly not put to death in practice when found guilty nearly as often as they would when found guilty of other things like murder murder or treason. To be honest, many people in general, and even the prosecutors, were usually not incredibly shocked by buggery and sodomy cases, and during the reign of King James I, things were especially lax due to the fact that the king himself was involved in relationships of the homosexual sort. Still, it wasn't exactly a friendly environment either, and gay men still had much to fear, and increasingly so as the 1600s went on, and Puritanism had a grip on English society, pushing fear of anything seen as a moral transgression. The world of pirates, hundreds if not thousands of miles away from the grip of these laws or social battlegrounds, obviously would have had a unique society in many ways removed, though not completely removed, from the influence of landfaring social norms. Historian Christopher Miller writes, "Men experiencing love or sex with each other on the high seas was not liberation or the embracing of a suppressed identity, it was simply a fact." An important factor of this as well is the fact that many men joined pirate crews incredibly young, some of them as young as 13 to 16 years old. They were effectively being raised not only in a homosocial environment by other men, but also other men for whom homosexual engagement and preferences are completely normal. This paired with the fact that pirates were notoriously superstitious and very much so about the threats that women could pose,
because women have crystals in their body and the crystals attract demons,
means that relationships with women outside of port-stop dalliances were often discouraged, though obviously not unheard of. If you've seen my recent video about the queer Old West, you may remember our discussion about how this sort of homosocial society functioned in cowboy communities, and how it often led to what effectively was gay marriages. The pirate world had its own system of gay marriage too, called Matelotage, which is where the word matey comes from. In its original purpose, Matelotage was when two men sought each other out as companions in order to share assets and property for mutual gain. This was officiated through verbal vows or written agreements. It needs to be said that not all Matelotages were sexual in nature. Some were purely economic. Sometimes these partners were genuinely just very good friends. No matter the reasoning though, matelotage was an incredibly useful economic tool for men at sea, with no other laws to protect them. It meant that they could then control where their money and possessions went when they died, ensuring that it ends up with someone that they care about. It also allowed an inlet for pirates to confirm their emotional bonds to each other on a higher level. We'll touch on that more in a later video. That doesn't mean that life on a pirate ship was easy though. Peter Earle writes in Sailors, English Merchant Seamen, 1650 to 1775, "One might imagine it was a life of poverty, brutality, and the great hardship, toiling and leaking sailing ships across the oceans, subject not just to the storms and threat of shipwreck with which the modern sailor is familiar, but also the threat of capture by the numerous predators who plied the seas, and to the arbitrary discipline of captains and boatswains ready with lash and cane to drum their crews into obedience. These men had few mechanical aids, no electronic wizardry to tell them where they were, no wireless to call for aid, no cans to preserve their food. They ate salt food, slept when they could in crowded leaking forecastles, lived in damp smelly clothes, and relied on muscle, common sense, and knowledge of the sea to carry their ships across the globe. They were cheated, shortchanged by officers and ship owners, duped by victuallers and prostitutes, abused and reviled by those who made their living on land. Despite the hardships, though, people will go where the jobs are plentiful, and this era saw an explosion in commerce at sea as triangle trade was solidified between the Americas, Europe, and West Africa. Europe exported manufactured goods, the Americas exported things like flour, meat, rice, tobacco, and cotton, and Africa exported sugar, rum, and, obviously and most tragically, human beings to be forced into chattel slavery. The more the slave trade increased, so too did the trade of other goods, which only increased the number of pirates looking to plunder and resell those goods. So, I'm sorry, but I need to make this very clear. Whether we like it or not, and regardless of our modern view of pirates as swashbuckling anti-imperial rogues, the hard truth is that historical pirates were absolutely complicit in and profited from, if not directly participated in, the transatlantic slave trade. This is obviously a multifaceted issue given the fact that at the same time, many pirates themselves were formerly enslaved or were rescued from or escaped slave ships, and this is not to say that all pirates were doing the worst with regards to the slave trade, but the idea that historical pirates were somehow anti-colonial and abolitionist as a whole just isn't true. Their goal was plundering for profit. Generally, to them, it didn't matter where that profit came from. Choosing a life of piracy came with a very heavy price. British law both in Europe and the colonies meant that almost certain death was in store for captured pirates, and oftentimes these pirates, especially the big names, would be publicly executed at the gallows as a spectacle, and then their bodies would be hung within view of the sea in a man-shaped cage. The famous Captain Kidd, one of the pirates to really define pirate history as we know it, was hung and then patted down with tar to slow his decomposition, and then hung in one of these cages for several years high up on Tilbury Point near London as a warning to all seafaring folks. This is what we do to pirates. If you didn't die at sea of disease or hunger, odds are you'd still die young at the end of a rope. The truth is, many pirates weren't these old grizzled men we see on movies or TV. More often than not, they were extremely young, in their 20s or 30s, if not their teens. And typically, their careers would be surprisingly short. Even Blackbeard, one of the world's most famous pirates, only served as a captain for about 2 to 3 years, and his pirating career in general wasn't much longer. So, what reason would an extremely wealthy gentleman with everything to lose have for becoming a pirate? Please welcome to the stage, Major Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet was born on Barbados in 1688 to a sugar plantation-owning family. The plantation was established by his grandfather, Thomas Bonnet, who was one of the earliest aristocrats to colonize Barbados. It goes without saying that the Bonnet sugar plantation, like all colonist plantations of the era, operated on slave labor. At the time, Barbadian colonial law defined enslaved people not only as property, but as real estate attached to the plantations. It was a brutal and horrific system that only continued to get worse in order to make the wealthy plantation owners ever wealthier. Stede Bonnet's father, Edward, passed away in 1694 when Stede was 6 years old, and his mother, Sarah, passed not long after, making the child a very, very wealthy orphan. The Barbadian law bestowed a martial title upon landowning aristocrats, and so, essentially with no military expertise whatsoever, or intent for that matter, Stede Bonnet technically became a major. Finally an adult, Stede had what seemed like everything in the world. He had wealth, he had land, he had status, he had a title, and he had earned absolutely none of it. All of it was his by pure chance and lucky birth and, well, through the subjugation of the people who worked his plantation. He could very well skate through life at this point comfortably doing fuck all, but the unease was starting to set in. In 1709, Stede married Mary Allonby, the daughter of another plantation owner. She was 16 at the time. Together, they had 4 children, Allonby, Edward, Stede Jr., and Mary. They lived very comfortably, beyond comfortably, actually. They lived in complete and utter luxury, and yet, Stede Bonnet was deeply unhappy. Captain Johnson writes in his book that Bonnet had some discomforts that he found in a married state that caused a disorder of the mind, and this is quite literally the only contemporary claim we have on it. We have no idea why he was struggling with being married, and so any possible explanation could apply. Stede Bonnet biographer Jerry Moss theorizes that it has something to do with the Jacobite Rebellion of 1688, as Bonnet was a well-known Jacobite sympathizer. The 1688 revolution in England ended the reign of King James II, cutting off the Catholic Stuart control over Britain and leading to the uprising of the Jacobites, aka the supporters of King James. The early 1700s saw numerous massive riots, and Jacobite Scots were gunning for an independent Scotland. This conflict was an explosive political divide in Britain and its territories. Moss theorizes that since Bonnet supported the Jacobites, his marriage would have suffered if Mary was on the side of King George I. But again, we'll never know. This theory is just as likely as any other. Maybe it was political. Maybe he had family trauma from being orphaned. Maybe he was gay. Moss also offers the theory that he had dementia. Some historians believe that his wife just, nagged a lot. All wives do is nag, 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 right, fellas?
I mean, marriage is stupid. Who the hell even gets married? People that love each other? Ugh.
Everybody knows that seeking a life of crime on the high seas is the only cure for the marital blues. Except, Stede Bonnet has no idea how to be a pirate. That's right. In 1717, under cover of night, Stede Bonnet threw away his aristocratic life, abandoned his family and property, and became a pirate. He told people he was going on a short trading trip and was never seen by Barbadian society again. As an avid reader, Bonnet likely craved some form of escapism and thought being a pirate must be as good an escape of his life as any. Stories of seafaring adventures and pirate tales were incredibly popular at the time, and no doubt the book-loving Stede would have been enraptured by them. But as we'll see, he was also incredibly naive and sheltered and had no idea what a real pirate's life would entail. Bonnet purchased a sloop called the Revenge from Captain Godfrey Malbone, using a loan, and outfitted the ship with 6 cannons and hired 126 men for his crew. And yes, he literally did have a library of books brought on board as well, and apparently did actually read his books to the illiterate crew. Allegedly. Ironically, given his background, he actually paid all these men a salary out of his own pocket, which was unheard of in the world of piracy. The Revenge went north to the Virginia Capes and then to North Carolina and back up to New York, capturing at least 4 ships and thoroughly interrogating the people on board to gather intel that would help them plunder more knowledgeably. After regrouping on Gardiner's Island, they headed towards Charlestown, South Carolina, now known to the colonies as pirates. They waited off the coast to capture a ship, which surrendered as soon as Bonnet's crew raised their black flag, which looked like This flag, commonly attributed to Blackbeard, wasn't actually his flag, but is instead a flag called Old Roger, first described in Ralph Delahaye Payne's 1911 book, The Book of Buried Treasure, being a true history of the gold, jewels, and plate of pirates, galleons, etc., which are sought for to this day. Fuck, dude, brevity in your titles, please. And he actually said the flag belonged to a captain named John Quelch, who actually never even flew this flag, but his crew stated outright in his trial that they flew the English colors. In 1933, historian Charles Gray misreported Old Roger as the Jolly Roger and attributed it to some random crew of pirates, furthering the Roger confusion. Finally, in 1978, for unknown reasons, the book The Pirates of the Spanish Main by Douglas Scott Botting attributed Old Roger to Blackbeard, and it's been known as Blackbeard's flag ever since. Anyway, back to the story. Although his first several plunders were actually successful, it was incredibly clear that Bonnet had no knowledge of maritime affairs. The crew was becoming uneasy. Captain Johnson writes, "Nothing but confusion seemed to attend all their schemes. In short, they were just lucky up until this point." But Bonnet had gotten a big head about it despite his lack of leadership skills, and the minute they spotted a Spanish merchant ship off the coast of Florida, he decided to attack. Except, it wasn't a merchant ship. Turns out, it was a Spanish man-of-war, and the Spanish struck back hard. Bonnet was almost instantly gravely injured and knocked unconscious. Half of Bonnet's crew were killed or injured, and the ones left managed to get him below decks and steer the ship away and escape. Bonnet pathetically isolated himself in his cabin to recover, while the Revenge headed south towards Nassau. Bonnet and his crew were in horrible shape. In Nassau, well known as a nest of rogues crawling with pirates, they would at least find some respite from the authorities. Of course, it was only a matter of time before he crossed paths with one of history's most notorious pirates who was operating out of Nassau, Blackbeard. Getting these stays on is not easy. On December 5th, 1717, a man named Henry Bostock survived an encounter with the dread pirate Blackbeard, who by that point had already become extremely infamous despite his absurdly short career as a captain. Bostock described him: "The captain, by the name of Captain Tatch, was a tall, spare man with a very black beard which he wore very long." This description of Blackbeard would later be sensationalized in Captain Johnson's biography, elaborating, "So our hero, Captain Thatch, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard, from that large quantity of hair which covered his whole face, and frightened America, more than any comet has appeared there a long time. This beard was black, which he had suffered to grow of an extravagant length. As to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons and small tails, after the manner of our Remilly's wigs, and turn them about his ears. If anything, the man known as Blackbeard knew how to dress to impress." Blackbeard is, and has always been, a problem child. Most of the questions we all have about him will probably forever go unanswered, and what little we do know about him is often hotly disputed. Even his name is a source of historical conflict. We actually have no idea what it really was, in part due to his unknown early life, and the fact that in the 17th to 18th centuries, last names didn't always have a standardized spelling, and in part due to the fact that as a pirate, Blackbeard would have been expected to probably have changed his name at least once. Most people decide to settle on the commonly agreed upon Edward Teach, born on a beach, or Edward Thatch, but still others believe there's evidence to support it actually being Edward Drummond. This confusion will become a pattern with our friend Blackbeard. So, Edward last name is often assumed to have been born in Bristol, England around 1680. We have no proof, but sure, it makes enough sense. People said that his father was a privateer, and a successful one at that, and so young Edward received schooling and was actually literate. Bristol has no shortage of local legends about Blackbeard's early years. One legend that our flag means death ended up drawing from is the story where Edward's father passed away when Ed was in his early teens, and his mother remarried to a man who deeply disliked him. This stepfather regularly beat him, to the point where Edward couldn't take it anymore and returned the favor, beating the man almost to death. Edward then fled away from home in fear and got himself a job as a cabin boy on the first ship out of town. He ended up in Port Royal, Jamaica, where he nurtured a career as a seaman on merchant ships before becoming a privateer himself. Now, there's absolutely no hard evidence to back up this tale, but it makes sense why people are so attached to it. It definitely makes sense in the grand scheme of Blackbeard's short life, but while we don't know much of anything about how or why he turned to piracy, it can be assumed that, like many other men, it just seemed like the most attractive line of work to him. Regardless, he ended up under the tutelage and command of the famous pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold himself would later give up his life of piracy for a royal pardon and went on to become a pirate hunter, tracking down the very people he used to call his friends and comrades. What a scoundrel. But long before that, in 1716, Hornigold took the young Edward last name under his wing and literally taught him the ropes of piracy. Edward, not yet known as Blackbeard, was in his 30s by this point. He would be dead within less than 3 years. But he made those last few years count. It didn't take long for him to become a leading player in Hornigold's crew. By all accounts, Edward was charismatic, eager to take risks, and had a weird sort of charm that made him a prime personality for piracy. That, paired with his education under Hornigold's wing, set him up to become notorious. In March 1717, the crew arrived in South Carolina with 2 sloops, one commandeered by Edward. A Captain Matthew Munthey sent a report of the scene to South Carolina's Deputy Governor Robert Daniel, writing, 5 pirates made the harbor of Providence their place of rendezvous, visited Hornigold and a sloop of 10 guns and about 80 men, Thatch with a sloop of 6 guns and about 70 men. Technically speaking, Edward was now functionally a pirate captain. By summer, Hornigold and the man now known as Blackbeard parted ways and sailed as 2 separate entities, though they continued working together until fall, when Hornigold was deposed as a captain for refusing to attack English ships. This is the point at which Hornigold had his villain or redemption arc, depending on whose side you're on, and became a pirate hunter. Blackbeard was already making a name for himself. In early November, the Boston Newsletter reported, arrived Captain Codd from Liverpool and Dublin with 150 passengers, many whereof are servants. He was taken 12 days since off our cape by a pirate sloop called Revenge, of 12 guns, 150 men, commanded by one Teach, who formerly sailed mate out of this port. Revenge? That ship name sure sounds familiar. Blackbeard was absolutely killing it, looting and converting ships off the coast of Delaware, though apparently not actually killing. He has a great deal of rumors about him, which we'll get into in a minute, but reportedly he never actually killed anybody until the day of his death when he was fighting for his life. That's not to say he wasn't aggressive, though. He now had 3 sloops under his control and was diligently capturing and reselling cargo. But there was another vital piece of information at the end of that Boston Newsletter article that changed the game and would alter the course of Blackbeard's final year of life. On board the pirate sloop is Major Bennet, who has no command. He walks about in his morning gown and then to his books, of which he has a good library on board. He was not well of his wounds that he received by attacking a Spanish man-of-war, which killed and wounded 30 to 40 men, after which, putting into Providence, the place of rendezvous for the pirates, they put afore the said Captain Teach on board for this cruise. It goes without saying that this Major Bennet, of course, was actually Stede Bonnet. Blackbeard and and Stede Bonnet's chance meeting, just like literally everything else in these stories, is highly disputed on details, but given the best evidence we have, they met in the fall of 1717, probably in Nassau. Bonnet was very injured at the time, so they agreed that Blackbeard would command the revenge while Bonnet chilled out and recovered from his wounds. Captain Johnson had a lot to say on the encounter. On his way, he met with a pirate sloop of 10 guns, commanded by one Major Bonnet, lately a gentleman of good reputation and estate in the island of Barbados, whom he joined. But a few days later, Teach, finding that Bonnet knew nothing of maritime life, and with the consent of his own men, put in another captain, one Richards, to command Bonnet's sloop, and took the major on board his own ship, telling him that as he had not been used to the fatigues and care of such a post, it would be better for him to decline it and live easy and at his pleasure in such a ship as his, where he should not be obliged to perform duty and follow his own inclinations. Seems incredibly odd, right? Bonnet's men at this point were fed up with his crappy captaining, and the threat of mutiny loomed like a storm cloud over Bonnet's head. Why on earth would Blackbeard, who seriously had his own business to be dealing with, already in command of multiple ships and dozens of men, bother with taking in this random other captain while he recovered? It seems like there was only a few possibilities. Blackbeard was just being a nice guy, Blackbeard was planning on slowly taking over Bonnet's ship from the inside, or Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet were mateys. Well, sorry to say, but yet again, we will never know for certain. Blackbeard biographer Angus Konstam is of the opinion that Bonnet was effectively a prisoner on Blackbeard's ship, and Blackbeard took over because Bonnet's vulnerability was clear. Personally, I'm okay with just saying, well, I don't know, because we don't. We absolutely have no idea what was going on between Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet, in part because we know so little for certain of who, as a person, Blackbeard was. Blackbeard is a figure overrun by so many brutal rumors and legends that the man underneath them is almost completely obscured. There are infinite claims of him torturing prisoners, throwing women overboard after breaking their necks, him having 14 or more wives, one of which he would regularly torture, him having a secret wife and child in London. Quite a lot of rumors involving him, having issues with women. If that's true, I guess it's one thing that he and Stede Bonnet would have had in common. But on the other hand, having permanent trouble in your relationships with women doesn't necessarily mean that you're gay. It could just mean that you're a misogynist. I mean, just look at how many straight men literally just hate women. On the flip side, however, we have no evidence that he wasn't gay either. It's forever an unsolved mystery. It's wholly possible that they had something going on, if not just because sexual relationships between men in the pirating world, as we touched on earlier, was so incredibly common and normalized, even encouraged. Also, Bonnet wasn't mistreated. He just kinda hung out, recovered from his wounds, and read his books. The way Bonnet lived under Blackbeard's command, even if he was a prisoner, isn't remotely in line with what people thought and still think of who Blackbeard was. If Blackbeard really was as brutal and ruthless as is believed, why was Stede Bonnet treated so well? Even more well than Blackbeard treated his own men. Anyway, am I gunning desperately for them to be gay and in love? Not really. First of all, I'm not exactly rooting for the IRL Mr. Stede Plantation Boy Bonnet. More than anything else, I just think it would be really interesting if true, and just like Taika Waititi and David Jenkins, I think the idea pisses off homophobes a lot, and that makes me happy. But if you watched my video on the idolization of LGBT historical figures, you probably already can figure out my personal stance on how upholding most queer or possibly queer IRL historical figures as our little meow meows will almost always come back to bite you in the ass. Because, unfortunately, I do need to remind you that this is the early 1700s, and pirates weren't necessarily good people with humanitarian goals. As I said before, they weren't Robin Hood types, and their job was to steal and sell off cargo. So looking for a hero or idol in a real-life historical pirate is just playing a losing game. Anyway, as Blackbeard took command, the team started picking up win after win. One notable plunder was their capture of the French slave ship La Concorde off the coast of Martinique, which recorded that an Edouard Teach took the vessel and its 455 imprisoned African people on board. Blackbeard, contrary to some recent claims attempting to make him out as a hero, could not have given less of a shit about the human cargo that he took into his custody, and like most other pirates, his goal was to offload them as soon as possible because what he really wanted was the ship La Concorde. You see, Pirates loved to steal slave ships because they were built for speed. The faster the ship could move across the Atlantic, the less people would die on board. Pirates also obviously had a need for speed. Having been a privateer for years, probably, Blackbeard knew a fancy ship when he saw one, and as soon as he saw La Concorde, he wanted that sucker bad. The crew sailed south, where a few of La Concorde's French crew members voluntarily joined Blackbeard's crew, as did some of the most able-bodied African men, and Blackbeard gave his small ship to the rest along with 3 tons of beans. The Frenchmen named this ship Mauvaise Rencontre, which basically means bad encounter. No kidding. Unfortunately, we have no records of what happened to the enslaved people from La Concorde. It would be nice to think that they managed to escape on the island they were dropped off on, but who's to say? It's assumed that most of them probably ended up in Martinique after all, and some others were recruited into Blackbeard's crew, which was allegedly up to 40% black. After this, Blackbeard renamed La Concorde to Queen Anne's Revenge and outfitted her to be a pirate ship. Stede Bonnet was brought on board with Blackbeard, along with his library. It was at this point that Blackbeard and Bonnet came up with some aliases. Blackbeard apparently went by Captain Kentish, and Bonnet used Captain Edwards, which he'd actually used early on in his career. After a number of highly successful plunders, Blackbeard actually gave Bonnet his ship and crew back, and they parted ways. It seemed to be on good terms. Unfortunately for Bonnet, though, his time observing Blackbeard's captaining expertise didn't help him enough, and it wasn't long before he beefed it in another failed plunder. The crew had just about had enough. By chance, they ended up reconnecting with Blackbeard again, and this time, Blackbeard was clearly fed up too. Bonnet was brought onto the Queen Anne's Revenge, while Blackbeard's buddy Richards commanded the Revenge, and I know y'all were waiting for this guy. Israel Hands, who was about 16 or 17 at the time, commanded the third ship, the Adventure. For now, Bonnet's time as a captain was over, although it appears he still took on something of a co-captaining role with Blackbeard on occasion. Regardless of the details, contemporary reports from the time often still listed him as a captain, with just as much importance as Blackbeard. At this point, Blackbeard was like, hey, what if I do something a little bit crazy? Let's go fuck up Charlestown, South Carolina, now referred to as Charleston. In 1718, Blackbeard and his squad rolled up to the Charlestown harbor with 4 ships and hundreds of men. In the boldest, most brash move of his entire short-lived career, he blockaded the harbor and took numerous ships hostage. But why? Blackbeard did manage to capture quite a bit of loot doing this, particularly rice and tobacco, but this is time-sensitive cargo and would almost surely begin to rot in the duration of the blockade, so it's useless if not quickly sold off. Blackbeard seemed to have another prize in mind. With things growing more dire for South Carolina by the day, the merchants sought help from Governor Robert Johnson. Johnson later reported, about 14 days ago, 4 sail of them appeared in the sight of the town, took our pilot boat, and afterwards 8 or 9 sailed with several of the best inhabitants of this place on board, and then sent me word that if I did not immediately send them a chest of medicines, they would put every prisoner to death, for which their sakes being I complied with. After plundering them of all they had, the prisoners were sent ashore, almost naked. Blackbeard could have demanded pretty much anything, and he was looting anything valuable that the harbor had to offer. He could have demanded money, but the thing he wanted most was medicine. He sent a man named Master Marks ashore with a list of medicines he demanded and waited. It's impossible to know exactly what medical crisis was ailing Blackbeard and his crew. It could have been yellow fever, as they had previously been around the Gulf of Honduras, but even more likely is the possibility of venereal disease, syphilis specifically. This is further supported by recent excavations of the still existing wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was finally discovered in the 90s off the coast of South Carolina. Archaeologists discovered among the wreckage a urethral syringe still bearing traces of mercury, which at the time was a common treatment for syphilis and other STDs. In fact, the syringe had clearly been used shortly before the ship sank. If enough time had passed for the disease to reach its incredibly painful second stage, it makes sense why Blackbeard and his crew would have done something this gutsy to get medicine. Having gotten what they wanted, the pirates stripped the hostages of any nice or valuable clothes they had, sent them ashore nearly butt naked, destroyed the looted cargo they got just to be assholes about it, burned their looted ships, and then, finally, left Charlestown, mostly unharmed. Blackbeard and his crew had gotten their penis mercury and even recruited some new crew members off some captured slave ships. Things are looking up! Except things are not looking up. Blackbeard's blockade of Charlestown earned him a hell of a grisly reputation, and he quickly became colonial America's most wanted man. After the whole Charlestown incident, Blackbeard knew he wasn't just a wanted man, he was the wanted man. While he sought out places to lay low, he heard about the new royal pardon deal, aka the Acts of Grace, or the Proclamation for Suppressing of Pirates of 1717, issued by King George I. Any pirate who surrendered themselves to the proper authorities would receive a pardon, and were even eligible to receive a bounty of up to £200 to turn in their own captains, which in today's money is around like 40,000 freaking dollars. In a turn of self-preservation, Blackbeard sought out Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, but first, he needed to downsize his massive crew. The funny thing about Blackbeard is that for all the hearsay of him committing great violence, there's actually not much evidence backing any of it up. But it's undeniable that Blackbeard was incredible at nurturing an image of himself as just short of a literal demon. All intimidation and bravado and threats, to the point where even his own crew believed it. In particular, his second-in-command, Israel Hands, who for the rest of his very short life after piracy was going around telling people how spooky scary Blackbeard was. It's entirely possible that a lot of the bombastic stories in Captain Johnson's biography may have come directly from Izzy Hands' mouth. On one occasion, Blackbeard apparently missed his shot while firing at a different crew member, striking Hands in the knee and disabling him for life. When Hands asked Blackbeard why he did it, Blackbeard said, "If I did not now and then kill one of them, they would forget who I am." We have no record of Blackbeard murdering any of his crew, but making a show of trying to, or they'd forget who he was, is pretty telling in itself. He had developed a reputation so much bigger than him, he never even tortured his prisoners either, the way many other captains did, like Charles Vane, for example, whose favorite hobby was torturing people. On one occasion, allegedly, Vane's crew actually had to stop him as he tortured a prisoner by tying him to the bowsprit and poking at his eyes with burning matches, while forcing a loaded pistol into his mouth. Vane would later find himself mutinied and sent adrift by his crew, only to end up shipwrecked later. But regardless of whether or not Blackbeard ever killed any of his crew, he certainly did wrong by them in 1718 in a pretty bad way. In June of that year, Blackbeard and his 4 ships arrived at the topsail inlet of Beaufort, North Carolina. Shockingly, Blackbeard had his precious Queen Anne's Revenge run aground on the sandbar, on purpose. The subsequent attempts to free her only made it worse, and the ship was now unsaleable along with the also now wrecked Adventure. Blackbeard then informed Bonnet of his plan to seek a pardon from Governor Eden and asked him to go ahead to Bathtown to apply for pardons for both of them while he stayed behind to salvage what he could from the ships. By this point, Bonnet was interested in returning to the legal lifestyle, so of course he took his crew and set off to go collect some pardons. And collect some pardons he did. Governor Eden was really chill about the whole thing, and Bonnet made his way back feeling pretty good about himself. Except, while he was away, in a true act of betrayal, Blackbeard had scraped the wrecks for anything worth a damn, marooned Bonnet's crew that was left there on the sandbar along with hundreds of his own men, and taken off. Blackbeard had even picked apart Bonnet's Revenge and left it there, basically useless. Thankfully, Stede Bonnet arrived and rescued them before anyone died on that sandbar, and the betrayal began to set in. Stede Bonnet was fucking pissed, and so were the abandoned men, too. They prepared their revenge to sail, all while dreaming up plans of actual revenge against that bastard Blackbeard. But this was a tough choice. As badly as they all wanted to go run after Blackbeard and get his ass, Bonnet had just been pardoned, and doing so would nullify the pardon. So what do? Well, it turns out revenge is the sweetest nectar, and Bonnet decided to get his ass.
Oh man! Oh god! Oh man!
He changed his alias to Captain Thomas and the ship's name to the Royal James, as if that was gonna fool anybody, and took off after Blackbeard. Sorry to say, Bonnet was still not great at commanding a crew, and it didn't take long for some of them to ditch him. He made his way to Delaware Bay and got done a few kinda mediocre plunders, effectively giving up his royal pardon. Things got kinda awkward. His crew confronted him about it, and at long last, Stede Bonnet said fuck it and decided to actually get his head in the pirating game. The next several plunders they had were not only successful, but vigorous. It's like Stede Bonnet was a completely new person. Maybe the idea of revenge had finally marinated long enough and he was sick of Blackbeard making him look like a fool. But the higher you rise, the farther you fall, and Bonnet finally made the poor decision that would end his short pirating adventure. He pulled the ship into the aptly named Cape Fear River to make repairs, which ended up taking 2 goddamn months. Long enough for the authorities to catch up. Colonel William Rhett had arrived one evening, effectively blocking Bonnet's squad into the river. Bonnet decided the only way out was to try and steamroll past the ships while firing chaotically in an attempt to shock them enough that the pirates could slip away. Needless to say, things didn't go as planned. Bonnet's ship ran aground hard, and Rhett's men prepared for battle. Except, the Cape Fear River is known for its impossible to spot and ever-changing sandbars, so the 2 enemy ships also ran aground. All anyone could do was wait for the tide to rise. Unfortunately, Rhett's ships were closer to the river mouth and would obviously come free first. Bonnet and his crew were forced to open fire anyway. The 2 sides fired at each other for 5 hours into the morning. At long last, the tide rose, and Rhett's ship came free, sending Bonnet into a panic. He ordered his ship's entire magazine to be blown up, basically ordering his men to all die together. For obvious reasons, everyone ignored him. Bonnet and his crew surrendered to Colonel Rhett, and his dreams of piracy and taking revenge on Blackbeard finally came to an end. Blackbeard, on the other hand, was absolutely cutting it loose over on Ocracoke Island, where he'd basically set up a pirate party crib. He'd met up there with Charles Vane and company, and things were going pretty great. He'd been spending a lot of time in Bathtown. Captain Johnson's book says that he got married there and was a real shit to his teenage wife, but we have hardly any evidence or other sources on this, or frankly any of his other alleged marriages, either. Obviously, that's not to say that he never married. Maybe he did. The only widespread rumor from the time he was alive was that he had a wife and kid in London. If he ever did have relations with any girl in Bathtown, she would more likely have been a mistress, not a wife. Either way, he wasn't in Bathtown for very long at all and was back at sea by summer's end. He picked back up where he left off with the whole pirate thing just in time for Pennsylvania's Governor William Keith to call for his arrest. But Blackbeard was getting cocky. Well, cockier. He felt untouchable. After his week-long party with Charles Vane on Ocracoke, everyone went back to causing colonial problems on purpose. This led to basically every act of piracy in American waters to be blamed on Blackbeard. The colonial governors were getting nervous and fed up. People in Charlestown were still pissed off about the whole blockade thing, and basically everybody just didn't want to deal with pirates anymore. The deputy governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, in particular, had it out for Blackbeard. Lieutenant Robert Maynard took 2 of Spotswood's ships and set off towards Ocracoke Island after Blackbeard, who had become so cocky that he didn't have sentries on watch to alert him of anything. Maynard arrived under cover of night and waited until daybreak to surprise attack the pirates. That morning of November 22nd, the pirates finally spotted Maynard's ship, and everyone prepared for battle. But Maynard's men were much more prepared in advance. In a panic, Blackbeard cut his anchor cable to save time hauling it up. The ship turned to face its pursuers, and the battle began. Maynard later recalled, "At our first salutation, Blackbeard drank damnation to me and my men, whom he stilled cowardly puppies, saying he would neither give nor take quarter." In other words, Blackbeard took a drink of liquor, swore damnation upon Maynard and his men, called them cowardly puppies. Then Blackbeard ordered his men to open fire. The details of the battle are confusing and tend not to completely add up, but it goes without saying that it was very bloody. The Adventure and Maynard's the Jane were linked together by grappling hooks, and Blackbeard's men jumped onto the enemy ship, ready to attack. But Maynard had smartly ordered his men to hide below decks, and as soon as the pirates boarded, they all sprang forth in yet another surprise attack. A fight without muskets, it was a brutal battle to the death. Blackbeard and Lieutenant Maynard fired at each other, and then attacked with their cutlasses. By this point, Blackbeard had been shot twice, but he seemed not to notice. The fight went on, and as Maynard's men overpowered Blackbeard's crew, they began to surround him from behind. Just as Blackbeard was about to deliver the killing blow to Maynard, one of the soldiers slashed him in the neck. Blackbeard, driven by adrenaline, continued to swing his sword wildly. The Boston Newsletter reported, "One of Maynard's men, being a Highlander, engaged Teach with his broadsword, who gave Teach a cut in the neck, Teach saying, 'Well done, lad!' And the Highlander replied, 'If it be not well done, I'll do it better.' With that, he gave him a second stroke, which cut off his head, laying it flat on his shoulder." Blackbeard, the scourge of the colonies, had died no older than his late 30s. In the end, he lost his head after all. The rest of the crew either jumped overboard or surrendered. Israel Hands, along with some of the other crew members, were ashore at the time and so managed to escape the bloody fight, though Mr. Hands wouldn't live long after this. He never fully recovered from his knee injury, and it's said that he died a beggar on the streets of London at the age of 23. Maynard and his crew took Blackbeard's headless body and tossed it overboard, where the legend goes that the body swam around the ship several times before eventually sinking. Of course, if the body was going around the ship at all, it's due to the shore current, but spooky nonetheless. Blackbeard's head was then mounted to the bowsprit of the Jane as a symbol of Maynard's success and as a warning to other pirates. Local legends say that Blackbeard's skull was later made into a novelty drinking vessel used in a Raleigh tavern. If this is true, it certainly isn't accounted for after the 20s. In the 90s, the famous New England pirate historian Edward Rowe Snow donated his collection of pirate artifacts to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. No relation, as far as I'm aware, but for some reason every time I encounter another Rowe in my research, it's always the most buck-wild shit ever. Anyway, in his collection was an object that he claimed was Blackbeard's skull. As it turns out, it's not. Allegedly, Mr. Rowe Snow just sprayed silver radiator paint onto a skull that he got from a biology class. But God, wouldn't that be something? In my research to find more info about this, I came across an article written by somebody named Cecil Crowninshield, who, claims to have some kind of experience with the skull and Blackbeard's ghost.
A gift of the widow Snow, the skull of Edward Teach aka Blackbeard has long haunted the depths of the museum, never to be placed on display. Why is that? I've spoken with Blackbeard's ghost, who you might remember is on the Spirit Council of Salem, largely due to the placement of his skull and the binding rituals placed by old widow Snow after it caused the death of her husband, Edward Rowe Snow, and he cites the fact that his murderer, a Lieutenant Maynard, turned his head into a drinking vessel.
Yeah.
Confided Teach to me over twigs from his brain case.
'Tis been my curse. I failed to read closely the fine print of the contract I signed with Ole Scratch. I thought I was selling my soul in order to cause great terror, but upon rereading the contract, I found it said great terror instead.
That's a long way to go for a pretty weak pun, I replied, taking another bony sip.
You'd be telling me,
sighed the ghost, staring gloomily into the drinking vessel that was once his head.
Can somebody who lives in Salem confirm whether or not Blackbeard's ghost actually serves on the local spirit council? Anyway, personally, I think Blackbeard probably would have gotten a kick out of his skull being a drinking vessel. Dude loved booze after all. L'chaim. Anyway, back to Stede Bonnet. In October of 1718, Bonnet and his crew were imprisoned in Charlestown. Bonnet's crew members David Heriot and Ignatius Pell agreed to testify against Bonnet in court. Bonnet had a brief chance at freedom when he and Heriot bribed their sentries and managed to escape disguised in women's clothing. Can you tell him my voice is dying? I'm dying. I've been talking for so long. A local mariner named Robert Tuckerman gave them a canoe, and 3 people enslaved by him rowed it away from Charlestown. Governor Johnson sent ships in pursuit of him unsuccessfully, as the group had gone into hiding on Sullivan's Island. They were soon discovered, however, by Colonel Rhett, whose men opened fire on the group, killing Heriot and one of the enslaved men, as well as one Native American man who had joined the group at some point. Bonnet, once again, was forced to surrender and returned to Charlestown for the last time. What followed was a lengthy and grueling trial. So lengthy and grueling that I'll just skip to the verdict. 29 of the crew were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, and the judge said at last to Stede Bonnet, "The sentence that the law hath appointed to pass upon you for your offences, and which this court doth therefore award, is that you, the said Stede Bonnet, shall go from hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And the God of infinite mercy be merciful upon your soul." Shockingly, the public was not a fan of this. People cried out for a pardon for Bonnet, and Bonnet himself also went about seeking pardons of any sort. Even Colonel Rhett was in favor of helping Bonnet out, but Governor Johnson was not having it. In one final act of desperation, Bonnet pleaded Johnson for mercy. The letter is long as hell, so I won't read it out, but you can pause to read if you want. It's a real bummer. He also sent this letter possibly to Colonel Rhett. His words were in vain, though. Colonel Johnson was wholly unmoved, and on December 10th, Stede Bonnet was taken to the gallows at White Point. As he walked to his death, Bonnet held in his hands a bouquet of wilted flowers, which he still clutched as he died by hanging at 30 years old. Angus Konstam writes that Blackbeard was a victim of his own reputation, attacked and killed more for what he represented than what he actually did. He built up an image of himself that he eventually had to pay for. Centuries after his death, Blackbeard is remembered as one of the most famous, most bloodthirsty pirates in popular culture. That just goes to show the sheer power of rumor, legend, and Hollywood, baby. In 1922, the author Ralph Delahaye Payne, yes, the same guy that I mentioned earlier in the tangent about Blackbeard's flag, published a book called Blackbeard Buccaneer, which greatly helped to revive and reinforce not only the legend of Blackbeard, but the story of his time with the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet too. And boy, when I tell you this book is literally written like a fanfic, but it's not unfitting, right? Stede Bonnet, before Our Flag Means Death, is not frequently put in the same sentence as Blackbeard in popular memory. In fact, he's not exactly remembered much in the mainstream in general. Most people know Blackbeard's name, but before Our Flag Means Death, you'd be hard-pressed to find a random person who knew who the gentleman pirate was. But Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard were nearly permanent fixtures in each other's lives in the duration of each of their very short careers as captains. Their stories are inextricably connected, even though we have so little detail about what was going on behind the scenes, or why. We truly will never know the nature of their relationship. Your guess is as valid as mine. All of these pirates of history, in a way, never had a say over how they are remembered from the moment they chose their lives as sea criminals. So much of what we know about all of them is rumor and hearsay. I mean, much of the pirate canon out there is pulled directly from Captain Johnson's largely unsourced book, and I think that Our Flag Means Death is doing something really interesting with the underlying themes of the show when it deals particularly with Blackbeard's struggle with his reputation and image. It all comes full circle, bringing the radically fictionalized versions of these people all the way back to the real man 300 years ago who was crushed under the weight of the image that he built of himself and died for it. In the show, Stede is being crushed under the weight of Blackbeard's image too. Rhys Darby, who plays Stede, says, "There's a moment where he just went, oh god, I'm going to have to leave this because otherwise this guy is not going to be who he's supposed to be." And this anxiety backfires because as viewers we know that's not who Edward is supposed to be. He's so much more. But in his pain, Edward can't see that either. Jenkins says that Edward is definitely headed towards becoming the monster that people always rumored him to be. This feels to me very much in line with the beats of IRL Blackbeard's own life. He never managed to escape the monster he wanted people to think he was. But as a show determined to free these histories from the restraints of legend, let's hope that Our Flag Means Death's Ed and Stede do, in the end, find an act of grace in each other. Thank you so much for watching and learning about a couple of swashbuckling scoundrels with me. Let me know in the comments who your favorite Our Flag Means Death character is. I love hearing about everyone's faves. I'll see you next month for another video, but in the meantime, as always, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and eat some oranges to prevent scurvy. Don't make me tap the sign.